Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second of 3 webinars or online sessions that we're hosting in relation to the retail apprenticeships. We held one last Tuesday looking at the overarching changes to apprenticeships, and today we're going to be looking at on-programme delivery and assessment. So it's nice to see that some of you have rejoined from last week, so obviously we didn't put you off too much, and hopefully we will give you some more information today and cover some of your questions. As mentioned earlier, we're here to answer your questions. I'm supported by Tara Powerville, so by all means pop your questions in the box and either myself or Tara will be answering those as we go through the session. So what are we going to look at today? Today we're going to be covering the wonderful Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, and however you want to pronounce that. RATP seems to be the common form of phrase for that. Looking at specifically off-the-job training, looking at options for on-programme delivery and assessment, what resources we have at Pearson to support the on-programme delivery, and again looking at preparing for the next webinar next week on Endpoint Assessment, how you prepare your candidates for Endpoint Assessment. So, making a start. So the wonderful Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. For those of you that are aware, this is a register that is linked to the Register of Training Providers, which in order to deliver funded training as either a main provider or a subcontractor, you need to be registered, so ROTO. This is RATP, or ROATP, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And this is for any provider that wants to deliver apprenticeships from the 1st of May this year, ideally need to be on this register, and we'll go through some of the information now. So like I said, in order to deliver apprenticeships from the 1st of May, you ideally need to be on this register, and that's either as a levy-paying employer or as a subcontractor. Or for those employers that are non-levy paying as well, that you're using your apprenticeship funding for, then you would need to be on this register. There is a caveat to that. If you are providing less than £100,000 worth of apprenticeships as a subcontractor, you don't actually need to be on the register. But obviously, if you look at apprenticeship standards going forwards, retail is for the level 2 and the level 3 is £5,000 a learner. £5,000 a learner of a 12-month programme, you're looking at 20 learners a year, equating to your £100,000 cap. So if you are going to be looking at delivering potentially more than 20 retail apprenticeships and any other apprenticeships at £5,000, then again, if you are planning on delivering that, you won't be able to deliver unless you are on the register. So there are 3 types of application. So you can either be an employer provider, a lead provider, or a supporting provider. So an employer provider are those employers and others moving forward that have had a direct contract with the SFA in the past for delivery of apprenticeships and or adult skills funding, and they are looking to be the lead provider going forwards, either because they deliver the apprenticeship delivery themselves or that they subcontract part of or some of it out to other providers. So for an employer who wants to coordinate their own delivery, we are seeing a lot of employers on the register as employer providers. Again, they tend to be the larger national employers, but there are some smaller employers as well that are looking at going on the register because they want to control their delivery of apprenticeships and, in their instance, the levy spend. A lead provider is, again, as currently is, someone who manages the contract delivery and potentially has subcontractors to assist them in the delivery of that. So this will be the organisation that will have the contract with an employer to carry out the apprenticeship delivery. And again, they then may use subcontractors to deliver elements of that. In order to be a lead provider going forward, you need to deliver on, I believe, it's still over 50%. They said initially the majority, but I think it's 50% of the delivery has to be completed by the lead provider. This also applies to an employer provider as well. They have to deliver at least 50% of the on-programme delivery and assessment in order to be classified as a lead or an employer provider. We do have the supporting provider, so previously known as subcontractors. So a supporting provider, as I said here, is a specialist provider or a subcontractor that delivers less than £500,000 worth of funded provision per year, and that's £500,000 worth of funded provision of either levy or non-levy provision. So there isn't a £5,000 limit for each, it is a combined limit. So what happens if you've not applied? Well, the register opened earlier on this year, and we had the first information about those successful applicants in March. There is about 1,700 organisations on the register, and the register then reopened back in April for any organisations who weren't successful in their first application, or for any new applicants at that point. Now, we are supposed to be hearing about those successful applications at some point. Obviously, with the government going into purdah, we're not sure if this will be before the general election or whether this will be after the general election. We have to wait and see as to whether the government have had agreement to publish this list within the confines of purdah. The next window should be opening in June. I believe it opens on or around the 9th of June, so the day after the general election. Again, with the general election, we're not sure whether this will still happen, but it will reopen at some point, we believe, in June, unless there is a change of government. The link to the register can be seen at the bottom of that page. So, moving on. So the register is kind of critical for providers going forward, because like I said, if you're not on the register, you only have a limit of £100,000 as a subcontractor to be able to deliver going forward. So if you have an employer that comes to you directly and you are not on the register and wants to work with you, then they're going to have to go via a lead provider. So in order to deliver directly to an employer, you are going to need to be on the register. So if you haven't already applied, I would suggest you look at doing so in the next window. So we've had a question saying, are providers not likely to hear a decision if they reapply before the election? To be honest with you, we're not totally sure at the moment. Some information is being issued, some isn't. It depends on whether they had parliamentary sign-off before they went into purdah as to whether they could continue working on this. We know that the Institute for Apprenticeships had approval prior to the purdah that they could continue to review and approve apprenticeship standards and assessment plans. But because the register for apprenticeship training providers is managed by the ESFA, we're not sure. We haven't heard if the ESFA have had approval to continue to review this. So we will be asking the question. And likewise, if you can get hold of your account managers from the ESFA, I would suggest that you ask them that question as to whether they've had ministerial approval to continue as normal during the purdah period. Okay, so off-the-job delivery. This is, for those of you that dialed in last week, one of the key components of the apprenticeship delivery going forward that as a provider you need to be very clear on. This off-the-job delivery requirement is your requirement of 20% minimum that has to be delivered off the job. And we had a question last week as to what about if an employer is not prepared to release their staff for the off-the-job element. And that's what I said to the sessions last week, is actually if you have an employer that isn't prepared to release their staff for the off-the-job element, I would very seriously question whether or not an apprenticeship is appropriate for that company. The 20% off-the-job requirement is a mandatory legal, as part of a, sorry, not a legal, but a contractual requirement. So they are going to have to release their staff for this off-the-job element. As a provider, if you are not providing that 20% off the job and it is reviewed by the ESFA, then you could lose your funding, and then obviously the money that you've been paid for the delivery of that apprenticeship you may have to recoup from the employer, and you may not get that. So again, it's something that you need to make quite clear during the initial discussions about the apprenticeship program. If they're not prepared to release for 20% of the length of the apprenticeship, then they may want to reconsider the delivery of an apprenticeship provision. So As I say in the first bullet point, obviously off the job is classified as not being in the apprentice's normal day-to-day working environment and not delivered as part of normal working activities. So they can be in their normal place of work, just not in their normal environment. So from a retail perspective, they can be in the shop, but they can't necessarily be on the shop floor. So somewhere like a canteen or restroom, or within an office or a training environment facility if the retail outlet has that facility available to them. So like I said, the ESFA guidelines, it states, this is the funding guidance for 17-18, forget which year we're in. And again, if you put your email address at the end, I will send you out the links to the new funding guidance if you don't already have these. It must be outside of normal day-to-day working environment and not delivered as part of normal working duties. So previously, where you may have carried out some form of observation on the shop floor as part of the current MVQ delivery, that can still happen, but it is not classified as part of the 20% off the job. Anything that is delivered off the job has to be off the job. And again, it has to be during normal working hours. So, what can off the job consist of? It needs to consist of, or can consist of, the teaching of theory. So some of the theoretical elements, for example, health and safety or customer service, communications theory. Practical training, so it could be in an environment where the candidates are learning how to use a till or EPOS system. And likewise, learning support and the writing of assignments and assessments. So it may be that you have some kind of session with the learners where they're working through a written assignment, or they're working through some form of questions that you're working together in a room. So it doesn't include English and maths. Again, that is funded outside of the apprenticeship, and therefore the 20% delivery for that is counted separately. So English and maths, either GCSE or functional skills, if they're needed, has to be delivered outside of the apprenticeship time. And it cannot include progress reviews or on-programme assessment. So as I mentioned earlier about the observation, you may have carried out an observation for the competence qualification in the SACE framework. That wouldn't necessarily count towards the off-the-job training going forward. And something else to be quite aware of is that if you're going to deliver off-the-job training via a distance learning or an online learning element, that the 20% of off-the-job and the funding for delivery cannot be used solely for distance learning. So there has to be a blended approach for delivery of off-the-job training. So it cannot be 100% distance learning. You will need to probably, and a recommendation would be to look at scheduling the amount of time needed for off-the-job training into your contract that you sign at the beginning of the delivery between yourself and the employer. And again, even potentially down to actually writing the dates into that schedule to ensure that the 20% is covered. The 20% can also include any employer-related internal training that the candidate may need that is linked to the standard. So, for example, anything to do with induction or first aid, that again can be used towards the 20% if it is, like I said, delivered during their normal working hours and outside of their normal working environment. Again, you will need to ensure that this is listed in your documentation and that actually it can be mapped to the requirements in the standard. So in terms of 20% from a retail perspective, retail will take on average 12 months of on-programme delivery and assessment, with endpoint assessment added on to the end of that. So if we were to do a calculation of a 12-month programme, which is potentially 48 weeks to allow for annual holidays, you're looking at about 9.5 weeks off the job, which equates to 66 days across the length of the programme. And again, this is applicable at all levels. So if we have a candidate that has done the retail level 2 standard and is progressing onto the retail team leader level 3 standard, then again, they will still need to do the 66 days of off-the-job training again. So they did 66 days in their level 2 apprenticeship, they will still need to do 66 days in their level 3. So again, you need to ensure that the training that you are planning and the on-programme delivery that you are planning allows for those, in essence, 66 days per year. That is the minimum. So you can do more if needed or desired. And again, anything that the employer asks that's not mapped to the standard, so is over and above what the standard requires, can't be included in your 20% off the job, because that has to be funded outside of the apprenticeship funding element. So, options for on-programme delivery and assessment. So for those of you that dialed into the webinar last week, you may have heard me say, where there are no mandatory qualifications specified in the assessment plans, which is the case for all 3 of the retail standards, qualifications cannot be funded as part of the on-programme delivery and assessment. Now, that's not to say that you can't deliver a qualification. You are more than able to deliver a qualification. It's just that the funding will only be paid to support the delivery, the training and on-programme delivery to meet the standards. So if a qualification is mapped to a standard, then you can deliver the learning. It's just that the funding for the registration or certification, if there's a separate fee, cannot be funded out of the apprenticeship funding. The employer will have to pay for that separately. So you can, like I said, still deliver qualifications. But in terms of on-programme delivery and assessment, looking at both on and off the job training, because like I said, you need to consider what is also delivered on the job as well, is that you could potentially look at, in inverted commas here, classroom, because that's a loose term, so an off-the-job environment, based delivery of knowledge and theory requirements, again beneficial if you have a cohort of learners in a single location, or you have learners that can come and visit you on a day release basis, for example, in a separate environment. We also have you have workshop or simulated environments for practical deliveries, so you may have within your organisations simulated areas that you can have a till set up, for example, where you can role play certain situations. You can have this blended delivery, as I said in the last slide. 100% online delivery can't be funded, but a mix of blended learning can. So again, a mix of online and offline sessions. So that kind of feeds into the next bullet point, and I don't know if many of you have heard of this phrase, flipped learning. This is a new form of delivery style that seems to be gaining popularity over here in England. It started off in America and in sort of like the university undergraduate programs out there, where prior to a session, a teacher, lecturer, professor, assessor, trainer, whatever title you wish to give anybody in our industry nowadays, would set a period, set an activity, a mix of reading, research, information gathering about a particular topic. So let's take brand awareness, for example. So you would ask the candidates to go away and complete an online learning module about brand awareness, to go and research brand awareness in their own organisation, to do some further reading on brand awareness from specific sets of textbooks or resources that are available out there. And again, Wikipedia is a great example here of free materials. And then come to their normal session, where they would normally be a classroom delivery option, where the lecturer, tutor, teacher would stand up and provide this information during the session. The session is actually then, as the word suggests, flipped. So the candidates come prepared with the knowledge, and they then spend that session discussing what they've learnt as a group and working potentially on assessment activities. So this is a new form of learning style that seems to be proving quite popular. And again, it's putting the emphasis of learning back onto the learner, much like being in the workplace, being proactive and not waiting to be told the information, but actually to go out there and actively seek it. An alternative option again could be for work shadowing. So again, this could also potentially be considered off-the-job learning in terms of working in a different location or an office if they are working in a cash office environment, for example, to where they're normally working. So working in a different store, going to work shadow someone doing a different type of role. All of these can be considered as on-programme delivery and assessment. So as I said in the last session, you need to plan out your both off-the-job and on-the-job sessions. You could use a qualification to assist in the structure of this. But what I would say to you here is any assessments that you carry out as part of the on-programme delivery and assessment cannot then be reused as part of the endpoint assessment activity if, for example, a portfolio of evidence is required. Anything that is formally assessed as part of one programme cannot then be reassessed as part of endpoint. Again, you need to ensure that your delivery plans for on programme covers all of the required elements listed in the standard and assessment plan. So in terms of planning your delivery, these are your go-to documents. Your standard and assessment plans should be where you start and end your planning. So you need to ensure that where, for example, within the retail standards, you have a whole variety of different areas to cover that literally that state what the candidate must need to be able to do and what they must know. You need to ensure that during your on-programme delivery you are covering all of those elements. Like I said, you can use a qualification for the delivery of those elements, but be aware that one qualification may not cover everything that is required in the standards, and likewise you may have to deliver 100% of that qualification in order to meet the needs of that standards, whereas previously you may have only delivered 6 units, for example. You may need to deliver all optional units in order to cover the requirements or most of the requirements of that standard. You could potentially use recognition of prior learning, but if you use recognition of prior learning for a candidate that may have some background experience, again, the ESFA would not expect you to claim 100% of the funding cap for that learner. Moving on to the resources that you can potentially utilise to support your delivery and assessment, and as the majority of you said that you'd be looking for resources, let's see what we can offer you. We have the current BTEC apprenticeship workbooks and assessment activities, so they are available. They are developed for the SACE apprenticeships, but again, the content is still relevant. Obviously, they will be mapped to apprenticeship qualifications currently, but again, you would need to look at those and see which part of the standard they do meet. So there are materials currently available for SACE that could be used. We do have a new online system called Pearson Apprentice 360, which will be going live at some point this year, which will have online elements and will have online modules that candidates can use that work towards various elements of the apprenticeship standard from an on-programme perspective. As I said earlier, and I'll repeat it again, this shouldn't be used in its entirety for your on-programme delivery and assessment. It should form part of a blended package that works with the learner. So again, the learner is going to have to demonstrate if an online package is used as part of the off-the-job training, that actually the off-the-job training was being carried out during their normal working hours and not carried out in their own time. So again, we have the qualifications that again can help structure your delivery of on-programme assessment. And like I said earlier, we can fund the content delivery of that qualification where it maps to the standard, but the registration and certification costs and any external assurance or testing costs cannot be paid out of apprenticeship funding, so the employer is going to have to pay on top for that unless you offer the qualification as an optional extra to your employers as a freebie, if you like, and you absorb those costs yourself. What we will also be offering is our endpoint assessment preparation materials, so practice tests for the knowledge tests and guides for preparing for observations and preparing for professional discussions, which again within the retail environment are two of the main points of an apprenticeship endpoint assessment. Candidates currently that are undertaking SACE apprenticeships will be aware of observations and professional discussions, because that is carried out as part of their NVQ or competence delivery. For new apprentices going forward, obviously they won't necessarily have that background, so this might be quite of a scary thought for them. So I've had a question come through here that says, would this be appropriate? Oh, sorry, apologies, that's the question about off the job. Off the job, yes, can be delivered on either as a one-to-one approach, or it can be delivered in a group session. Again, it depends on your cohort of learners and whether you have a group of learners in one organisation, and actually from a retail perspective that they're actually all at work at the same time, which can often not be the case. So what we would be looking at in the future, and again, we can have this discussion after the session, or again, if you want to add this into the chat, into the questions window at the moment, we would be looking if you think it would be beneficial to look at creating some sample schemes of work and lesson plans to support the individual components of the standard. To give you some idea, for example, so brand awareness, financial elements, and so on and so forth. So if you think this is would be useful to you, again, either add it into the window at the end of the presentation, or to just speak with your account manager and just let them know that they're the kind of resources you'd be interested in looking at receiving. So moving on to the preparation for endpoint assessments. Well, as I said, this is one of the critical elements of apprenticeships moving forward. If an apprentice doesn't pass their endpoint assessment, they do not achieve their apprenticeship, and again, they'll be down on your ILR system as a leaver non-achiever. I will go into more details about endpoint assessment when we have the webinar on this next week. It'll either be Monday or Friday next week, I can't remember which day it is. But we'll be going through in more detail what these are. So in brief, endpoint assessment, like I said, is the last week is the confirmation of occupational competence. So the successful achievement of the endpoint assessment means that candidate is deemed occupationally competent at whichever occupation they are working on. Prior to the endpoint assessment activities taking place, then we will have a gateway process. So this gateway process is a formal meeting that happens between the training provider, the apprentice, and an employer as a minimum. And the employer will confirm occupational competency. The group will also confirm that the candidate has met the English and Maths requirements. So, for example, for a level 2 retailer, that they have achieved a minimum of a level 1 English and Maths, and ideally have sat a level 2 English and Maths test. Sat, not achieved. Or for level 3 retail team leader or retail team manager, that they have achieved level 2 Maths and English, either GCSE or functional skills, and this is as a minimum. You will also then discuss the timeline for endpoint assessment. Now, the endpoint assessment activities take place over several sessions, so several different interactions between the endpoint assessor and the apprentice, so it doesn't all happen on the same day. So again, working out the timings for that so that the apprentice knows when they're going to have their assessments, and likewise you have scheduled that in with your endpoint assessment organisation, because there will need to be an independent assessor involved. So again, they will need to be booked in with plenty of notice. As I mentioned last week in the endpoint assessment preparation, if either party, the employer or the training provider, is not confident that the apprentice is fully competent, then the candidate or the apprentice should not be put forward for endpoint assessment. If any party has any doubts that candidate will not pass endpoint assessment, they should not be put forward. There is only one resit opportunity for endpoint assessment, so it will cost you as well. So if you pay your endpoint assessment fee and a resit's required, and in most cases there will be a resit fee applied. So again, that will need to be costed in, and maybe an additional cost to that employer if the funding cap has already been reached. There is 20% of funding is withheld throughout the apprenticeship programme until the completion of an endpoint assessment, not necessarily an achievement of an endpoint assessment, but completion. This 20% worth of funding isn't there to pay for endpoint assessment as commonly believed. It is there as a completion stroke achievement payment, as you currently receive now. But it is there as an achievement payment rather than as an endpoint assessment payment. You may have already had to pay the endpoint assessment organisation prior to the commencement of endpoint assessment activities. As I mentioned in the last slide, obviously we have preparation for endpoint assessment support materials available. Once you have registered a candidate for endpoint assessment and a date's been allocated for the first activities, support materials will be available to you at that point. Then you can then share them with the apprentice, and obviously part of the run up towards the gateway process is starting to prepare the apprentice for endpoint assessment and providing that support function.